Bonjour, everybody, and welcome to my presentation today. I'm so glad that you've joined me to learn a little bit about dyslexia in the workplace. I'm coming to you from Melbourne in Australia, and I'm super excited to have the opportunity to present at this research conference around equality, inclusion, and diversity. I'm just going to share my screen with you now and my presentation. So before I get started, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I live and work, and they're the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to any First Nations people who might be listening in or participating in this conference today. I would also like to acknowledge and thank my supervisors who have supported me throughout my research journey. I've just submitted my thesis, and I'm super excited that I will soon be able to be a formal doctor of sorts. So I am with Trobe University, and I'm also the director of my company called Rethink Dyslexia, and my charity called Dyslexic. And it's because of my work in that space that I decided to do my research looking at the lived experiences of adults with dyslexia. But today we'll be talking about their workplace experiences and how we can better support them. So once again, a big thank you to my supervisors who have been with me for this 6.5-year journey. I'd also like to take a minute to acknowledge my beautiful mother, who sadly passed away at the end of last year, and hasn't been able to see the final achievement of me finishing my thesis, but I know she's with me, and she has been with me every step of the way. And during this presentation, you'll start to understand the importance of family support for those who are dyslexic. Also, there is my sister, who's been an amazing support for me along my journey, and my little daughter, who's now actually 2 years of age, who is a driving force for me doing all the work that I do. So what is dyslexia? So today I wanted to talk to you about dyslexia in the workplace. When I was 27, I was diagnosed with dyslexia and dysgraphia, two specific learning disabilities. And following my diagnosis, I became quite ill with significant mental health issues. And part of that reason was because there was a real lack of support and understanding about what dyslexia was, particularly in the workplace. And I felt that I had been let down by a number of different education systems. I was diagnosed while doing my master's degree. So I'd already graduated and completed my speech pathology degree and was now doing my master's. And what we found through my research, that this is not uncommon to be diagnosed as an adult, and it's not uncommon to experience a lack of support and discrimination in the workplace. And so that is why I wanted to do my research in this area, looking at how we could better understand the lived experiences of adults, particularly in Australia, but also what their work experiences looked like. And so that's why we're here today to talk about that. So dyslexia affects 1 in 10 Australians. If you look overseas, they say 1 in 5. If you're looking at dyslexia in the UK and also coming out of the US. We are born this way, and it's highly genetic. So my dad, we think, is dyslexic, one of my brothers and some of my nephews, so it's very strong in our family. We also know that dyslexia is not related to intelligence, and that it's on a spectrum from mild to severe. And that's particularly because of whether we get intervention at a young age, but also our education opportunities as we progress throughout our schooling, whether we end up getting to complete secondary school and go on to higher education. But for me, my dyslexia and my dysgraphia impact me enough where no matter how much study and research and writing I've done, there's still a lot of mistakes, and I'll talk a little bit about that. at the moment, in a moment. But dyslexia is a phonological-based reading difficulty. So we have difficulties in putting sounds together to make words and to read words. And so this has a flow-on effect to our ability to read fluently, to comprehend what we're reading, and our reading speed can be impacted as well. But dyslexia is so much more than just a reading difficulty or disability, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. In Australia, dyslexia is recognised as a specific learning disability, and it sits under that umbrella. It also sits under the umbrella of neurodiversity. And so dyslexics make up 50% of the neurodivergent population. And when we're talking about neurodiversity, we're looking at, we're talking about people that might have autism, ADHD, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, and dyspraxia. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So what does that mean for people who have dyslexia? So we have difficulties in writing because our spelling and grammar is impaired. When we try to write, then we're always going to have mistakes in our writing. But for me, my dysgraphia impacts me more with my writing. So I have significant writing impairment. So I have trouble communicating what's in my head onto paper, and it can be quite disorganized if you're reading it. Tenses will be missing, so my grammar will be impacted, my spelling. And it's just disfluent in the way I write. And we find that that's not uncommon for people who have dyslexia, but for me, it's even more impaired than someone who doesn't have dysgraphia. When we're looking at spatial temporal difficulties, so those with dyslexia may have difficulty telling left from right. We get lost quite easily. So even though I use Google Maps a lot, I still can't sometimes pinpoint where I need to go, because Google Maps will only show you a certain area and then you've got to find the location. So I might be walking up and down the street trying to find where I need to go. And some people have difficulty telling the time. When we think about listening, those with dyslexia can really struggle with a lot of background noise. So I can't have the radio on with ads if I'm driving the car. I can't have ads on the television if I'm trying to have a conversation with someone. If we're in a noisy cafe, I won't be able to focus. So if we're thinking of in the workplace and someone's in an open planned office like we have in Australia, then they may have challenges in being able to read and write, especially if it's important work that they're trying to concentrate on. As I mentioned, spelling is impaired, so we have sound confusion and also letter confusion. So that can then impact on how we spell a word. We might have difficulty finding a word too, so we might not be able to find how to spell it if we don't know the start of a word. So I normally ask Siri now how to spell a word, because sometimes I won't be able to look it up myself because the sounding of the word is different to what I think it is. And then we might have trouble remembering how to spell a word. So one day we might remember how to spell it and then the next day we can't. And that can be really frustrating for us. And it can look like to other people that we're being lazy or not paying attention, because one day we might be able to do it and the next day we can't. Motor control. So for those who are dyslexic, they may have poor handwriting and handwriting difficulties. So it might be illegible. They might have difficulties copying from a screen, from a board, or from a computer. And then we have memory difficulties. So for us, our short-term memory is really impacted, but over time, our long-term memory is really, really strong. But we might have challenges with phone numbers, so remembering numbers. So like if we get a code on our phone for two-factor authentication, we might forget just those 6 digits. Can be really hard for us to remember. Dates and times as well. So if you're thinking about in the workplace, being able to give someone multiple instructions, those with dyslexia may only be able to retain the first 1 or 2 instructions and not remember the rest. And so that can impact our workflow and how we manage day to day. So when we're thinking about dyslexia, we also know that it comes with multiple co-occurring difficulties, or part of that neurodivergent umbrella that I spoke about. So it's more common than not to have a co-occurring difficulty. So as I mentioned, I have dysgraphia, but what we know is that dyscalculia, so significant mathematical difficulties or functional math skills, can be impaired for those that have dyscalculia. ADHD and autism we're quite familiar with now. and there's high rates of ADHD and dyslexia. Around 14% of those who have autism will also have dyslexia. Then speech and language disorders can be overlaid, and also developmental coordination disorder, or what we talk about in Australia still as dyspraxia. And that's been really having difficulty with your motor skills, more so than just handwriting, like for those with dyslexia. So you might have difficulty tying up your shoes. When you're a child, you might have challenges riding a bike. Hand-eye coordination with handball coordination when playing sports can be challenging, and the overall just a bit more clumsy as well. And so you can have one or more, but most of the time, multiples of these co-occurring difficulties. And then what we see is the overlay of social and emotional challenges because of that. So the adults with dyslexia are twice as likely to have depression and anxiety, are 46% more likely to have attempted suicide. And also through the research I've done through the first part of my study, where we looked at mental wellbeing using a standardized tool from the UK, the Warwick-Edinburgh Wellbeing Scale. I think I missed a letter there. Our population had lower levels of mental health and wellbeing compared to the general population. And this was looking at positive psychology factors. So do I feel loved? Do I feel confident? Do I have good coping strategies? Do I feel mental fatigue or exhaustion? And what we found was that for those with dyslexia, they had higher rates of mental fatigue and exhaustion compared to the general population. And we'll talk about why some of that could be in a minute. So we know that employment and job security are key factors and positive factors in our health and wellbeing, or they should be positive factors. And they play an integral part of who we are as we progress into adulthood. But in Australia, there's been little research that's looked at, or there's been none until my research, that's looked at what happens across the employment life cycle for adults with dyslexia. So we know that there's been a lot of research in Australia and overseas looking at the educational needs of dyslexic individuals in school and post-secondary school, but really there's been no attention paid to once we transition out of school into the workplace, but as we progress through adulthood and beyond. And this is despite in Australia and overseas as well having a lot of legislation that protects adults with dyslexia and children from discrimination, and we are protected under the Discrimination Act and the Human Rights Act and the Fair Work Act in Australia. Even though we're protected under all these acts, there's still not a strong commitment to supporting dyslexics in the workplace. So when we first started out on our research, we were really wanting to look at just the retention challenges that people might be having. Well, that's the area that we thought would be most difficult for those with dyslexia. But what we actually found was across the employment life cycle, those with dyslexia are having challenges from recruitment all the way through to career progression and when they moved on from an organisation. And this was quite surprising to us, but really noteworthy when you're looking at the importance of work in our lives. So when we interviewed our cohort, what we saw was that those with dyslexia were having a lot of difficulties during the pre-employment and the recruitment process. This included challenges around disclosing their dyslexia during the interview process, writing CVs and selection criteria in Australia. For a lot of jobs, especially in health and the professional fields, we have to write a paragraph or two on a set of questions. And so that can be really difficult for someone who's dyslexic. I know I used to get my mum, who helped me get my education and get my degrees through her editing support. She would always have to proofread and edit and help me draft my selection criteria and my CV. So that took a lot of time. So people are spending a lot of time already trying to just put their hand up for a job before they even get the opportunity to be interviewed. When successful in being selected for an interview, what we found were pre-interview aptitude tests such as psychometric assessments really held dyslexics back because they ran out of time. They couldn't answer the questions quick enough. And when they did ask for reasonable adjustments, they were told, just do your best. So they really weren't on an even playing field, even just at the beginning of applying for a job, and they weren't able to demonstrate their skill set or their broad skill set because of these different barriers that were being put in front of them. And then also the difficulty of disclosing their disability, because not all organisations felt psychologically safe for them to disclose. So then they couldn't ask for the reasonable adjustments that they might be entitled to during that process. This is just a quote. This is a quote from one of my participants who, during their pre-assessment test that they failed, and this is what they had to say. I failed the government test. After the test, two ladies sat in front of me and said, "You don't look dumb. We've never seen anybody fail a test as bad as this." And I said, "Well, I'm dyslexic," as I dropped my eyes. So we heard lots of different stories from participants about discrimination just in the recruitment process and how they were made to feel inadequate when trying to apply for jobs. What we also found was that those with dyslexia actually work across a broad range in all different sectors at all different levels. So from on the ground staff through to academics, CEOs, board directors. So dyslexics are everywhere, and many of them were finding these barriers to different roles that they were applying for. So it wasn't just a subset of jobs that this was happening in, this was across industries. When we looked at onboarding, what we found was that those with dyslexia struggled to understand contracts, so they were signing off on things without understanding the implications of that. When undertaking on training during the onboarding process, a lot of it was online and through e-learning courses, so they weren't able to listen, they had to read, so there was a lot of reading they needed to do even before they really started their job. And again, there were no points during their onboarding process where they felt that it was safe to disclose that they had dyslexia. In Australia, there's a form that asks us if we have a disability when we're completing our onboarding documentation. And most times those with dyslexia won't tick that they have a disability, either because they don't feel their dyslexia is a disability or they're fearful that they'll be discriminated against if they tick that box. And I'm one of those people. I don't disclose I'm dyslexic during the recruitment or onboarding process because of past negative experiences I've faced around discrimination and lack of understanding of dyslexia. So this is what one participant said. I'm just going to sign off on each regardless. And so there needs to be an alternative strategy for them to at least comprehend what was in it for them. So people are signing up to things without really understanding the consequences if they do something that isn't part of the agreement they're signed up for. So when we looked at retention difficulties, which is what we thought we were focusing on, what we found was that those with dyslexia have a number of literacy-based difficulties. So sending and reading emails, writing reports, the speed and their ability to comprehend what they're reading in the workplace. So a lot of the times there's a lot of written documentation, and they felt that they had strained working relationships. And this was partly because they had to work longer hours, so they might get in earlier to complete tasks so they could keep up with their peers. They might work through lunch or work back late. So this meant that they couldn't then participate in activities that the broader team could be doing. And so this started to cause friction between other team members and also feelings of isolation for those that were dyslexic. Some team members also felt that those with dyslexia might be relying too heavily on their support, and that they weren't able to, that they were either being lazy or weren't really pulling their weight. And one example would be that those with dyslexia struggle to take minutes. And so if someone says they don't want to take minutes in a meeting and it's constant, then it looks like they're not being a team player. They may not also want to get up and write in a group setting in front of everyone on a whiteboard or to take notes because they're fearful of people seeing their spelling mistakes. But also, if you go back to thinking about our short-term memory, if you're asking someone to do some writing while participating in an activity, that can be really difficult for them because they're trying to hear what they've got to take notes on, then they're trying to work out how to spell the words, And then they're also being asked to participate as well. So these activities can be really difficult and challenging for someone with dyslexia. But what was most distressing was the fact that a lot of people at some point throughout their working careers wouldn't disclose in their job that they had dyslexia because of fear of discrimination and fear of how people would perceive them, from them being stupid, some really negative words that we used to describe what they thought people were thinking about them if they said they were dyslexic. And it really demonstrated that there was a significant lack of awareness within organisations across Australia, and that people didn't feel psychologically safe to disclose that they had dyslexia and then get the help that they needed. But most importantly, what we found was that those employees that have dyslexia are facing significant mental fatigue. So like our first research project looked at around the wellbeing scale, what we were finding was this ongoing mental fatigue in the workplace, because those with dyslexia are having to put in a number of workarounds to manage their workload, whether it's starting early, finishing late, having to reread constantly so that they're editing and trying to find the mistakes before they send documents out. Even using reasonable adjustments in the workplace takes extra time as well. So they were finding that they were feeling really, really fatigued at the end of the day. And then this could present as them looking disorganized or careless, not keeping up again with their peers because they were starting to tire really quickly, and then aren't able to manage tasks by the end of the day. So if we look at from a manager and organisation's perspective, what we found was that managers, if they understood and they knew that their dyslexic employee, their team member had dyslexia, and they had experienced dyslexia themselves within a family, within a friend, they were much more likely to be empathetic and supportive to their dyslexic employee. Managers felt that when there was a lack of understanding about what dyslexia was and the characteristics of it, that's when the discrimination could start to occur. And for some people, performance management ended up happening because they wouldn't disclose that they had dyslexia because they didn't feel psychologically safe, and the workplace wasn't set up for them to be able to disclose. And what we found was that managers really saw this mismatch between their employees' ability to carry out some tasks and then not be able to carry out others. So they might be really verbally articulate and they could explain and describe in a meeting orally what they were thinking and what they wanted to do. But when they had to put it on paper, it just didn't translate. And so managers would think that, again, they're being frustrated with their looking at them being lazy or disorganized or not paying enough attention. So these kind of labels were coming through from team members and also from managers when they didn't have an understanding and they hadn't been trained in dyslexia and what it might look like for a dyslexic employee. And so when we're looking at organisational barriers, that lack of understanding and awareness was significant across all organisations. There were no policies or procedures that explicitly supported dyslexic employees, so there were standard disability policies and procedures and like anti-bullying, all the ones that we need from an OH&S perspective. But what wasn't there was how they support neurodiverse, or particularly those with literacy difficulties. And that could be someone that's English as second language, has dyslexia, hasn't had the best education. So there was nothing there to support low literacy skills. And so this made those with dyslexia feel alienated and isolated because they weren't being able to access the support they needed from that overarching organisation level. And again, I keep coming back to this inability to disclose, and then this low levels of psych safety within organisations. And when we looked at organisations that had inclusion and diversity committees, what we found was those with dyslexia didn't have a seat at the table. So they might have people with autism there, or ADHD, starting more and more ADHD. People with ADHD are coming forward to get support. But what we found was there was nothing for dyslexic. So again, even in the inclusion and diversity space, they weren't feeling safe to come forward because they didn't feel that they had a place, and there wasn't anything at an organisational level that made them feel safe enough to disclose. So they're constantly having put up all these coping strategies, and as some talked about, this secondary persona where they couldn't really be themselves because of their dyslexia, and they were too busy being fearful of being ousted or people finding out that they had dyslexia, that they were putting all these workarounds in. which again created a lot of mental fatigue. So at an organisation level and at a manager or leadership level, there's really limited support and understanding at the moment. And then this is having a significant flow-on effect down through to employees with dyslexia. This is just one participant's comment. So how do I manage prioritizing of conflicting pressures and the multiple tasks with the burden of writing and editing it? How do I get it done in time with an influx of work at the same time? The mental load that has on someone who struggles to organize thoughts, prioritize, juggle the plethora of parts, and it's an enormous mental load. And this just reiterates what I've been speaking about those challenges that we're facing ongoing in the workplace. So what we also found was that for those that were in higher roles, that they weren't able to either progress because they were worried that their strategies they currently had that they could manage, where no one knew about dyslexia, their dyslexia wouldn't help them as they progressed up their career ladder. So they felt trapped and stuck in either a role within an organisation or generally in their field because they didn't feel that they could move beyond it, either to go back and learn more, or just that they didn't have the strategies needed to progress. Some felt that they'd hit a glass ceiling that should be, not selling, sorry, dyslexia coming out there. And so again, they just felt that they were in a manager or leadership role and they weren't going to be able to progress any further. And they felt that even when they did disclose in their organisation that there was a lack of opportunities because they felt that their managers didn't believe that they'd be able to manage in a new role, and so they were limiting them to being stuck into just one role. And this was really distressing to hear. What we found though, and what the research is starting to indicate, is that dyslexics have many strengths that they're drawing on to support them in the workplace. And I think if we're looking from a workplace perspective and inclusion and diversity, we're wanting to look at people's strengths regardless. When someone comes into a role, there's areas that they're always going to need to develop, and then there's areas they're really strong at. And so from a dyslexic's perspective, it's, well, how can we, or a manager, sorry, perspective, how can we draw on those strengths, not just to ensure that we've got positive well-being within a team, but that we're utilising the skill sets that we have within a team. And if you're looking at how we build teams, we want to build teams where everyone's coming with a different set of strengths. So when I manage teams and I'm hiring people, I'm looking for people that, you know, are detailed because that's not an area I'm strong at, or I'm looking for someone that's really good at writing because I know that's an area of weakness. But I'm also knowing that, you know, for me, what I'm really good at is that visionary, the problem solving. And so I want to build a team where we're all fitting in with bringing our strengths rather than looking at deficits that we might have in the workplace. Because no one's a perfect package. We always have areas that we need to be building on and developing. What we know is that for those with dyslexia, through my research, they actually felt that they had a lot of strengths that they brought into their roles. You know, they showed up day in, day out, even though they were fatigued, even though they might be feeling discriminated against, or they might be struggling. And so they had a real sense of resilience and perseverance. They had high levels of self-awareness. So they really understood where their limitations were as such, and then how to put the strategies in so that those limitations didn't affect them day to day. But they also knew the areas they were really, really strong at, and they were the aspects of the jobs that they absolutely loved. And that's what made them come to work day in, day out. They're also strong problem solvers. That should be, sorry, again, you know, with my mum passing away, I don't have her editing my work anymore. And so this is one of the difficulties moving forward, though I do have a strong network of family who normally edit my work. But problem solving is one that we're also, they identified that they were really strong at. And some of the research that's coming out is also leaning towards these types of strengths. And I think as we move into an era where artificial intelligence is progressing, we are going to need employees that have stronger soft skills in the workplace, and that's high levels of emotional intelligence, empathy, resilience, the ability to communicate, tell stories, to have strong problem-solving skills, to be visionary. Those are the characteristics that AI doesn't have. And so when we're looking at in the workplace, it's how can we utilize those skills that dyslexics have, and some of those more day-to-day processed tasks are some of the things that AI will be able to take on. So it's looking at how can we balance this new technology coming in with employees that have really strong areas that AI can't do. And so thinking from an inclusion and diversity perspective, it's how can we leverage the strengths of our team members moving forward. So what does this mean for dyslexics in the workplace? When there's an absence of resources and reasonable adjustments, we know that those with dyslexia are facing higher levels of being mentally unwell in the workplace. And this can lead to job burnout because of the significant amounts of stress and anxiety that they're feeling, and mental fatigue when they're not set up properly and they don't have the resources they need. And in Australia, untreated mental conditions are costing our workplaces over $11 billion annually. So that's a significant amount of money. And even though we can't attribute how many of this cohort are dyslexic, we know from my research and international research that they are struggling in the workplace. And so they are fitting into this cohort here. And it's really what can we do to reduce the risk of them burning out and then impacting the overall goals of the workplace, because we're working in companies that are trying to achieve KPIs, productivity, but if we've got staff that are unwell or that are feeling this stress, then productivity goes down, and then we've got this spiraling effect within our organizations. So how do we create more inclusive workplace practices? So our research used the job demands resource model of burnout to help us look at, were the difficulties those with dyslexia having were just because of their difficulties, or was it the environment that they were in as well that was contributing to them not being able to manage as well as they could? And so what we found is that we can mitigate or reduce job burnout and improve the way people work by giving dyslexic employees more autonomy, enabling them to have colleagues where they're being supported and they've got peer support. So where you're bringing two people together that have different strengths is really what managers found could be really helpful for dyslexic employees. That organisations have open policies and really clear upfront around how reasonable adjustments can be accessed in the workplace, and that everyone has access to them, not just those with dyslexia, but anyone who's neurodiverse or English as a second language. We talk about universal design principles where, an example would be Grammarly, which is an amazing spell checker and helps with writing now, that everyone in the organisation gets access to it, not just the dyslexic employee. We need to really have explicit policies and procedures from recruitment all the way through to career progression that support dyslexic employees. And training is a significant part of increasing and improving the well-being of dyslexic employees. And that's organisation whole training down to specifically managers, HR and leaders, because they really need to have an understanding of how they can support their dyslexic staff, which then helps them create these psychologically safe and high-performing teams in the workplace. Also, the ability to have workplace assessments. We know that dyslexic assessments are very costly in Australia. They cost over $1,500. So looking at how we can better improve access to early assessments so that then those with dyslexia can get the workplace adjustments that they need. And having a budget to access reasonable adjustments is also really important, and that's usually at the manager's discretion. So again, having that training for managers is really important so they understand what type of reasonable adjustments are needed and then how they can access them and use them. And then by doing all of this, we're improving our workplace culture, which helps us develop a good self-awareness for everyone. It creates psychological safe environments where we have built and work through trust. If we don't have trust, then we're not going to have a high-functioning team. We're not going to have a functioning team. So by building that trust from the ground up is really, really important for all teams, regardless of their neurodivergent staff. People come into the workplace with a variety of things that are happening in their personal life. And last year, my mum was dying. Someone might be going through a marriage breakdown, their child might be sick, looking after a parent. There's multiple things. And then we're coming into the workplace and we want it to be safe and secure and somewhere where we can come and do our job and do it really well. And by building that trust from the ground up is a way of enabling that. So people feel safe to talk about their difficulties, whether they're at work or at home, and there's strategies in place to support them. Working to people's strengths, as I talked about, and people's personal resources are really, really important. So dyslexia does not have to be a major barrier to success in any occupation, and we've been able to demonstrate that when we have the right reasonable adjustments in place, we can succeed, and managers have seen our dyslexic employees just thrive in the workplace, and that's what we want to be seeing globally, not just within Australia. So in conclusion, employers play a vital role in improving job resources and the provision of social supports and disability-friendly policies and procedures, and ensuring that all staff are aware and trained around dyslexia and neurodiversity overall, and how we can be supporting this population of employees. And I don't think I mentioned at the start that it is 1 in 10 that have dyslexia, and out of that, we make up the biggest population of neurodivergent. So 50% of the population that are neurodivergent are also dyslexic. So workplaces really have a vital role in supporting this big population of employees that could be struggling silently with their disability because they're not accessing the support they need. And so we also know that when we're able to work to employees' strengths, that then we're going to have cohesive, high-performing, productive teams. And that's what we want as employers and managers. So the work I've talked about today is based on my research on the 3 papers that I've published, leading diverse workforces from a manager and employer's perspective, and then You Don't Look Dyslexic from the employee's perspective, both published internationally. And then my first paper was published in the Australian Journal of Learning Difficulties, and that looked at the mental health and wellbeing of dyslexics in Australia. If you need any help in supporting your workplace to be inclusive of dyslexic employees, please don't hesitate to email us for any further information. We have a range of resources, including podcasts for dyslexics, and we've got 57 podcasts that are available. We've also got a number of YouTube videos and a significant number of resources that we've built over time to support adults with dyslexia. We also have a closed Facebook group called Dear Dyslexic, and we also have a PhD support group for dyslexic PhD students that I lead with Dr. Judith Hudson, and that's called the Dear Dyslexic PhD Support Group. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation today. I'm really grateful for your attendance and for you coming to see how we can create more inclusive environments for those with dyslexia. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. So merci beaucoup and bye for now.